Welcome to today's master class to be delivered by Professor Bonnie Ibawa. The moderator will take over from me and introduce him. For those who joined the first one by Professor Ibawa, this is a fellowship one. At the end of it, we issue you a certificate, Fellow of the Master Class of Studies on Human Rights and Development, to be signed by Professor Ibawa, Professor Sajis, Kamga, and myself. And you'll be allowed to add FMSA to your name when you so choose. It is my privilege to invite Professor Sajis Kamga, the Dean of the Law School. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, there are students who are in halls and lecture halls. You won't see them, but they're in large numbers following this conversation. In one particular campus, over 250 students are in a hall, and some have joined by YouTube. Thank you very much. Professor Kamga.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. Please, am I audible?
We can see you.
Thank you very much, sir. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank you very much, sir. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here with you. Thank you for putting the masterclass together. To you, Professor Toyin Salola, really, we are privileged to have to take part to this great opportunity. I would like to, without further ado, briefly introduce Prof. Bonnie Ibawa, who is the Senator William McMaster Chair in Global Human Rights at the McMaster University in Canada. I would also like to say that he is the former expert mechanism, like a UN special expert who was working on, was the representative of African states on the African, at the UN Council. So he was the expert mechanism on the right to development. Perhaps before I give him the floor, to my great friend, Prof. Bonnie, with your permission, Prof. Bonnie, like at the last class, I will be translating briefly to summarize your thought for the Francophone students who are joining from Francophone Africa. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you very much, Professor Serge. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back again to give this master class. I want to once again thank the Tony Falola Network and Professor Falola for this great initiative. Like I said at my last class, one of the appeals of these masterclass sessions is that it gives us some time to go deeper into some of these questions relating to Africa in a way that a normal lecture might not, so presentation of a paper might not. So I want to thank Professor Falola for the forum and also thank Professor Kamga for that introduction. So I am told that this is an advanced class, so we will dig a bit deeper into the conceptual and theoretical debates relating to the right to development, a little bit more than I did in the human rights class I delivered a couple of weeks ago. That was, I think, a different class. No, this is an advanced class, just to be clear. This is an advanced class. So the human rights class was an intermediate class. So we'll dig a little bit deeper. So I do not intend to use slides for this class, but I always like to open with a couple of slides that set the tone for some of the conversations we're going to have. So I hope I do have sharing privileges so I can share a couple of slides. Professor Kamga, can you see the slides?
Yes, very well.
Okay, so I'll just start from the slide. So to set the tone for what I will be talking about today, I want to speak about where I am coming from. I teach international human rights here at McMaster University. And before then, I have taught international human rights from an interdisciplinary perspective in the United States, Europe, and also in Africa. But I come to this topic not just as an academic, I come as a practitioner. I come as someone who's been involved in many of these debates. And the perspectives that I bring to you today are not just abstract theoretical questions on the right to development. They are important global policy questions. For close to a decade, I served on the UN expert mechanism on the right to development. For more than 3 years of that, I was the chair of that important United Nations body based in Geneva. And the mandate of this body, which is a subsidiary body of the United Nations, was to really promote the right to development globally, to operationalize the right to development. I'm glad that Professor Kamgan himself now sits on this important body. But one of the privileges one had leading this body and sitting on it as a UN independent expert was that it gave one a very unique window into the practical, on-the-ground questions relating to development, but it also gave one a unique window into the multilateral conversations, the international conversations among diplomats, among politicians, among state representatives about some of the questions I'm going to be talking to you about today. And so when I speak about the right to development, I speak not from just the academic and theoretical perspective, but I also speak from a practical, policy-oriented perspective. The other preliminary point I want to make is that one of our mandates on the UN expert mechanism on the right to development was to produce studies for the United Nations, studies that would guide the United Nations and by inference, guide the member states of the United Nations on some of these important questions on development and how to actualize the right to development. And one of the studies that I personally led and completed before the end of my tenure on these mechanisms was a study on the individual and collective dimensions on the right to development. It is a study that was ultimately adopted by the Human Rights Council and a study that I presented both in Geneva and in New York. And many of some of the findings of that study I will be speaking about in the course of this lecture. And then I want to set a number of framing questions. What are we really going to be talking about today? I propose, if we have time, to look at about 4 or 5 key questions. What is the right to development? How do we define development? What are the post-colonial, and I would add, African origins of the right to development as a third world claim? Notice that third world is in quote. In other words, I'm trying to reference some of the points that have been made by others about what the right to development is. Why is the right to development contested? And I will establish that it is contested and try to explain why. What is the politics of soft law? Why is the right to development, even as we speak, not a legally binding instrument, not something that can be legally enforced? in courts and operationalized in many contexts. And what is the difference between the individual and collective dimensions of the right to development? Is it an individual right, and is it a collective right? And what does it mean when we have this debate about the individual and collective dimensions of the right to development? And then who's responsible for fulfilling the right to development? Is it a state obligation? Is it a collective obligation? Is it an international obligation? Or is it a bit of all of these? And then finally, I think the most central question that we all want to have an answer to is, how do we operationalize this right? If development is a fundamental human right, how do we go about operationalizing this right, particularly in the African context? So let us begin with trying to understand the basis of our conversation here.
Please, Bonnie.
Yes?
Yes, with your permission, let me briefly capture the introduction.
Yes, please.
For our French-speaking students and colleagues who are here. Bon après-midi, tout le monde. Vraiment, c'est un grand plaisir de vous avoir en ligne et puis de présenter le professeur Boni Ibao, qui est vraiment le meilleur qu'on peut avoir sur ce sujet, sur la question du droit au développement. Alors, il était, en fait, il était le président du mécanisme unusien pour le droit au développement. Il a travaillé pendant je dirais environ 6 ans, et pendant 3 ans, c'était le président des sciences au niveau des Nations Unies dans le mécanisme des experts pour le droit au développement. Alors, aujourd'hui, et un peu plus que la dernière fois, il va justement approfondir les questions. Il va pousser à fond parce que le niveau du cours aujourd'hui est quand même un niveau intermédiaire, c'est-à-dire un peu plus avancé que la première fois. Alors, il ne va pas simplement rester universitaire ou académique ou académicien, comme on dit souvent en français. Il ira beaucoup plus dans le côté de la pratique et il parlera vraiment de son expérience en tant qu'expert onusien sur la question de ses expériences dans les conversations avec les diplomates, avec les organisations internationales et dans tous les secteurs dans lesquels il a travaillé à l'ONU, et surtout quand il représentait les États africains dans le mécanisme onusien. Et en fait, c'est moi maintenant qui occupe le fauteuil qu'il occupait à l'époque. Et pendant qu'il était là, c'est vrai qu'il reste très impliqué parce que je travaille assez étroitement avec lui. Mais il a eu beaucoup d'expérience pendant tout ce temps-là. Et aujourd'hui, il va partager ses expériences avec vous au cours de cette lecture ou bien de cette présentation. Et il va, entre autres, poser des questions sur qu'est-ce que le droit au développement et quelle est sa nature et ses origines africaines et pourquoi le droit au développement est très contesté ou controversé ou un droit assez controversé. Et il va nous amener à répondre aux questions sur les politiques et des droits contraignants, des lois contraignantes et les lois non contraignantes. Pourquoi il y a ces politiques et comment elles jouent sur le plan international. Il va également s'appesantir sur la question du développement. Qu'est-ce que le développement? Et pour le droit au développement, il va répondre à la question de savoir si c'est un droit individuel, collectif, et quels sont les responsables? Sont-ils les États qui sont responsables? Ou alors c'est la communauté internationale qui est responsable? Et quels sont les devoirs? Et enfin, il va poser la question, comment est-ce qu'on peut mettre en œuvre le droit au développement, comment on peut opérationnaliser ce droit de façon pratique. Et je vous remercie et je lui repasse la parole. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Serge. So let us start from the foundation of our conversations this morning. And the foundational document that guides much of what we'll be talking about today is the Declaration on the Right to Development, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1986. This is the foundational document on the right to development. It's not a very long document, it's a relatively short document, but it encapsulates the global consensus on what development means and how to achieve it, at least within the context of international law. I will just highlight the two key opening articles of this foundational document. And I crave your indulgence to read part of it because it will guide much of what we'll be talking about today. It says in Article 1, the opening statement of that declaration, the right to development is an inalienable right, human right, by virtue of which every human person and all peoples are entitled to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy economic, social, cultural, and political development in which all human rights and fundamental freedoms can be realized. The operational words here are inalienable, which effectively means they cannot be taken away. They cannot be alienated by the state or any other entities. The other operational word here is contribute to, participate in, and enjoy. Participate, contribute, enjoy. Now, the second subsection of that article talks about the full realization of the rights of peoples to self-determination. So that now explicates what these rights are. Self-determination is central, subject to the provisions of the international covenants, that is, other covenants on human rights, and then inalienable rights to full sovereignty over their natural wealth and resources. So from the very beginning, you begin to get a sense of what this legal instrument, this declaration is interested in. Self-determination, natural resources, wealth, and participation. Article 2, the human person is the central subject of development and should be an active participant and beneficiary of the right to development. And then it goes on to talk about the responsibility for the right to development. All human beings have a responsibility for development. It is not just a state initiative, it is a collective initiative. And then finally, it talks about the obligation of states in section 2.3 to formulate appropriate national development policies to fulfill these rights. Now, I want to set the tone, and I thought these two articles really capture much of what I will be talking about today. I will now stop sharing and then go into the lecture proper and talk about some of the key questions that I already posed that I said will guide our conversation today. So let me start with the declaration itself. In 1986, when that declaration I just showed you was brought up at the United Nations, it had been drafted and it was now time for the nations of the world to vote on it. 146 countries voted in favor of that declaration. They supported it and they voted for it. 8 countries abstained. And one country in the world voted against it. The only country that voted against that declaration was the United States. The 8 countries that abstained from that declaration were mostly European countries, including Japan, United Kingdom, West Germany, as it then was, but they were mostly European states. But what is important is that 146 countries felt that this declaration that made development a human right was worth voting for and worth supporting. But the fact that the most powerful nation of the world, you have to remember that this is the context of the Cold War, so it was a bipolar world. But one of the most powerful nations in the world, the superpower, the United States, voted against this and, in fact, campaigned for other countries to vote against this. And that, for me, is at the heart of some of the conversations that I'm hoping we'll have today. Why was there such a contestation of a right or a declaration that that most of the world thought was, a logical sequence in terms of the progression of international human rights? And so the foundational premise of my conversation this day is to show that the right to development is not just another right. It is a contested right. And at the center of that contestation is what I call the polemics of power and the polemics of resistance. And I'm going to talk about how this has played out and ultimately how it is being resolved, attempts to resolve it within the United Nations and in the implementation of this right around the world. But let me, before I allow Professor Kamga translate, let me also add a question about what development really is. Because if you followed my reading of Article 1 and Article 2 of the Declaration, it talks about the right of individuals and peoples to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy development. But the Declaration does not define what development is. It doesn't tell us exactly this is what development is. It says, yes, we have the right to participate, but it leaves open the question exactly what development is. Of course, it is implied throughout that document, but what exactly is development? So let us start from that conversation. Now, it is well established that development, when we think about development, we have to go beyond economic development. Development is not just GDP, growth in GDP. Development is the objective improvement in the quality of life of peoples. That is the fundamental and simplest definition of development, that people's lives are improved, both individually and collectively. Development is not measured in terms of the number of skyscrapers in the cities or the GDP of a country or the infrastructure in that country, although those can be indices, some of the indices of development. But development is ultimately about the well-being of people. It is about freedom, it is about dignity, and it is about capacities. And here I really want to talk about the definition by the famous Indian economist who is widely recognized for his groundbreaking work on welfare economics and global social justice. Amartya Sen, who some of you may be familiar with, the Indian economist, defined development this way. And he says, development is the expansion of capabilities of persons as individuals and groups to lead the kind of lives they value. The capabilities of persons as individuals and groups to live the kind of lives they value. The operational word for Amartya Sen is capabilities, creating the capacity for individuals and groups to live the kind of lives that they want. So the right to development does not prescribe a particular model of development. It assumes that people participating in, contributing to the idea of development ultimately fashion and determine the kind of lives they want to live. And that is the ultimate measure of development. But before I go into the next phase of the class, which is the anti-colonial origins of this very unique right, I would like Professor Sage to make a translation.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Thank you for the clarity. Je voudrais donc rapidement capturer les idées du professeur. Il a commencé par la norme du droit au développement qui est centrée sur la déclaration sur la déclaration de l'ONU, la déclaration de 1986, la déclaration sur le droit au développement. Alors, il souligne deux articles qui sont clés, l'article 1 et l'article 2. Et quand on les ramasse, on dirait que le droit au développement, il est non négociable. On ne peut pas le négocier, on ne peut pas le mettre de côté. C'est un droit individuel, c'est un droit collectif. Et il insiste, et cet article insiste sur la notion de participation des populations, leur contribution et leur droit de jouir de ce droit qui est le droit au développement. Passant rapidement à l'article 2, il insiste sur l'autodétermination, la souveraineté sur les richesses et les ressources naturelles. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qui est central dans le droit au développement. Et aussi, et parlant de la responsabilité, il souligne la notion d'une responsabilité collective et du droit au développement et avec les États qui sont obligés de pouvoir ce droit-là. Alors, il revient sur la déclaration et le processus du vote en 1986. Il y avait 146 pays qui avaient voté pour, en plus, c'était la plupart des pays du tiers-monde, si on peut le dire. Et puis, il y avait eu 8 abstentions, alors 8 pays avec qui s'étaient abstenus. Et le seul pays qui avait voté contre était les États-Unis, et ayant battu une grosse campagne pour que d'autres pays ne votent pas. Alors, il démontre et il nous dit ben, les pays les plus puissants étaient vraiment contre le droit au développement. Et maintenant, ça nous ramène à la question de savoir pourquoi le droit est contesté. Et, et il va répondre en ça en nous parlant de la polémique du pouvoir et contre la polémique et des résistances. Donc, il y a deux questions qui sont centrales, la polémique du pouvoir et ça veut dire les pays du Nord et la polémique des résistances est présentée par les pays du Sud. Maintenant, il pose la question centrale qui est qu'est-ce que le développement? Et il note que la déclaration elle-même n'a pas défini ce que c'est que le développement. Donc, mais il pense qu'on doit comprendre le développement au-delà d'un développement économique basé simplement sur l'accumulation des richesses. Et il pense que on doit, la notion de développement consiste à améliorer la qualité de vie des populations. Et il y a les mots-clés qui sont la liberté, la dignité et puis les capacités des populations à pouvoir s'épanouir autant que possible. Et il prend pour autorité ici l'économiste indien Amartya Sen, qui avait vraiment développé la notion ou défini la notion de développement et avec un mot central qui était l'amélioration des capacités ou des capacités des personnes pour pouvoir s'épanouir et se réaliser. Donc, le droit au développement n'est pas un droit prescriptif. Et maintenant, et dans la suite, il va donc essayer de nous expliquer plus en profondeur les détails relatifs à ce droit. Je vous remercie. Over to you, Prof. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Serge. So let me now move to the anti-colonial origins of the right to development. If, like I have argued, that the right to development reflects the polemics of power and resistance, we need to understand the origins. So let us go back to 1986 when the declaration was adopted by the UN General Assembly. That came out of a very particular historical moment. And we need to go a little back into history to understand this. Now, after the Second World War, the newly formed United Nations that came out of the ashes of the Second World War built an international order that was on paper universal. The Charter of the United Nations spoke of, quote, the faith in fundamental human rights for all peoples. That was the language of the Charter. And of course, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted in 1948 by the General Assembly goes even further to talk about the fundamental and inalienable rights of all people. But in 1945, when the United Nations was established, most of Africa and large parts of Asia were still under colonial rule, and the Caribbean too. So here you have this anomaly of an international body claiming to put in place a global order founded on international human rights and universal human rights at a time when 2/3 of the world was still under colonial domination, still under repressive colonial rule. And so you have these very anomalous origins of the international political order. At the time of the forming of the United Nations, only 4 countries, only 4 African countries were members of the United Nations. Liberia, Ethiopia, and the Union of South Africa, Egypt also. So we can say that 50 countries in Africa that were supposed to abide with this new universal declaration, this new international order built on human rights, were not part of the conversations at the United Nations because they were not represented at the United Nations. They were under colonial domination. So you are confronted with a contradiction in thinking about the origins of the international human rights system. That the peoples whose rights were supposedly written into these declarations, in fact, most of the world were not free to exercise the principles that have been ingrained in these declarations. But all of these changed in the 1950s and 60s, in the era of decolonization, as more and more formerly colonized countries began to gain independence. India, of course, blazing the trail in the 1940s, followed by many African countries. In 1957, Ghana becomes independent and gets a seat at the United Nations. In 1960 alone, 17 African countries became independent. And so you saw a fundamental shift in the composition of the United Nations, from a small club of Western states to a much expanded club of formerly colonized nations, from Africa, from Asia, and the Caribbean. So there was a fundamental transformation of the structure of the international global order, at least in terms of the composition of the General Assembly. And many scholars have described this as the dawn of the post-colonial United Nations, the United Nations that was more representative of the peoples of the world. And once that began to happen, the new members of the United Nations started to raise fundamental questions about the nature of human rights and international human rights. They began to articulate the idea that political independence had not brought economic independence, that their economies remained structured around exporting raw materials to former colonizers in Paris, in London, and New York, and that there wasn't a system within the international system that protected their interests, their economic interests as new states. They articulated, and I think this is an important point to stress, that the global political and economic institutions that had been built after the Second World War, the Bretton Woods institutions, from the World Bank to the IMF, had been structured to address the challenges of post-war Europe, mainly. The human rights order had been structured to address the crisis of nationalism in Europe, with its emphasis on civil and political rights. What they wanted and what they pushed for at the United Nations was an expanded notion of what human rights were. Not just narrow, individualistic, atomized individualism, but also collective economic and social rights. So there was a movement to expand the understanding of international human rights beyond its narrow origins. And these really emerged in the context of 2 parallel intellectual movements. The first one is dependency theory, that some of you in the class may be familiar with. Scholars like Raoul Pretzbich and Andre Goode Frank, who were the proponents of dependency theory, made an interesting argument. And the argument was that the global economy was not simply behind the times. The global economy, particularly as it related to the developing world and the global south, was not simply behind the times in the global south. It wasn't just a natural progression in terms of how the world was evolving economically, and that development was just naturally evolving in a way that it was. Rather, they argued that the nature, the inequities in the global political system was a direct consequence of the organized way that wealth had been extracted from particular parts of the world to other parts of the world. And this is what they framed as the dependency theory. And their solution was that in order to create a more equitable world, one in which the global south could have a chance to develop, they had to delink from this global political economy that was skewed unfavorably against them. So the dependency theory in some ways influenced some of the intellectual debates of this period. The other movement, I would argue, that shaped the conversations leading to the right to development. Remember, we are still talking about the journey towards the right to development, was the new international economic order. So African and other post-colonial diplomats at the United Nations began to push for what they called a new international order, an order that created fairer trade terms, control of natural resources by colonized, newly independent societies, redistribution of decision-making in international bodies and multilateral organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and the UN. In other words, they began to ask for a fundamental restructuring in how the world was governed. And they framed this as the new international economic order. And this, a resolution was passed in 1974 by the General Assembly that affirmed these claims for a new international order. So it was in the context of these two movements, the dependency theory on one hand, which was mainly an intellectual movement, and this political diplomatic movement for an international economic order, that the right to development emerged. It was first articulated in 1972 by the Senegalese jurist Keba Mbaye while addressing the International Institute of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And Mbaye argued that development was not a favor bestowed by wealthy countries on peoples, but an inalienable right, owed as a matter of justice rather than charity. Now, I want you to understand how radical this idea was by these Senegalese jurists in 1972, because up until then, the classic assumption was that development is founded on charity, on development aid, on humanitarianism, that those who have a moral and ethical obligation to give to those who don't. And Mbaye was articulating at an international level that no, development is a fundamental human right. And he articulates it as a fundamental human right. Now, I need to say a little thing about this. He wasn't some radical.
We miss you.
Yes, pardon me.
We miss you a bit. Your sound when you were a bit muted. From the moment you were telling us that before the Mbaye lecture, development was perceived as charity. That's
Yes.
where, yes, please, if you can carry on from this.
Yes. Yeah, so thank you, Sage, and I appreciate you letting me know when my audio is muted. With technology, you never know. So I was saying that in 1972, when Keba Mbaye made this case in Strasbourg that development must be conceived as a fundamental human right, it was a very radical paradigmatic shift in the understanding of what development was. Up until then, development was framed in terms of humanitarianism and charity. But what Mbaye was saying was that development belonged in the language of rights, that development is a fundamental human right and should be articulated as such. This was a very radical framing at the time. And what it does was that it brought the language of international human rights that had up until then been almost exclusively associated with narrow civil and political rights to the realm of development. Of course, you already had the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights. So, in some ways, there was some kind of reference to human rights as an economic and social claim. But it was Mbaye's articulation that foregrounded development specifically as a human right. And before I allow Serge to translate, I need to say a little bit about Keba Mbaye, because at the United Nations, the right to development is often framed as a third world right, a right put forward by the global South after the end of colonial era. But if we really look at the history, it was essentially an African norm. It was something that African intellectuals and African statesmen pushed for most vigorously at the United Nations. Now, Keba Mbaye himself wasn't some activist or a diplomat. He was a jurist. He was the first African judge to serve as the vice president of the the International Court of Justice in Strasbourg. He was not a radical scholar by any means. In fact, many would say that Keba Mbaye was a conservative scholar, a conservative legal scholar, and a jurist. So he was working within the international human rights framework. And so when he articulated the right to development and articulated development as a human right, he was working within the framework of established international human rights norms. And I think this was significant because when Keba Mbaye and others, and it wasn't just him, articulated development as a human right, they were arguing very precisely that the needs of developing states in the global South, particularly post-colonial African states, had to be part of the language of international human rights. Because if human rights were to be universal, if we were to agree that human rights are universal, they can't just serve the interests of particular parts of the world focused on narrow civil and political rights. They had also to address the challenges of newly independent post-colonial states grappling with poverty, grappling with economic deprivation. And so these important considerations for developing states had to be part of the international human rights system. And that, my friends, was really the foundation of how the right to development became part of the agenda of international human rights. So, Serge, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bonnie. Thank you for the great lecture. I'm having a great time here listening to you. Alors, je vais directement passer à la traduction de ce que le professeur nous disait. En fait, dans son allocution, il nous présente encore très bien les origines anticoloniales du droit au développement. En effet, il démontre que depuis l'adoption de la Charte des Nations Unies, il y avait les États africains, alors leur philosophie et théorie n'étaient vraiment pas sur la table. En effet, quand il parle de l'adoption de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme, qui parlait des droits fondamentaux et qui présentait, en fait, cette déclaration présentait un ordre mondial et qui n'était vraiment pas en droite ligne avec les besoins des États du tiers-monde. En fait, quand les instruments internationaux étaient adaptés ou adoptés à cette époque, on avait les pays comme le Libéria, l'Éthiopie et l'Égypte et l'Union d'Afrique du Sud, comme ça s'appelait ces années-là. Et puis, tous les autres États, en fait, étaient encore colonisés. Alors, jusque dans les années 1950 à 60, et il y a eu quand même un grand changement avec l'avalanche des indépendances et qui s'est abattue dans le monde et avec le Ghana en 1957 qui a accédé à l'ONU, par exemple. Maintenant, et il parle d'une transformation qui avait été fondamentale à partir de ce moment-là parce que les États nouvellement indépendants ont commencé à questionner la nature des droits humains. Le droit de la personne, c'était quoi? Alors, les anciennes colonies se sont mises ensemble et pour estimer que non, la question des droits ne pouvait pas être simplement, et le développement ne pouvait pas être seulement économique. Les institutions de Bretton Woods, mais, et la Banque mondiale et le Fonds monétaire international et vraiment représenter les intérêts des Occidentaux. Alors, ça avait posé, et puis ils avançaient plus les droits civils et politiques. Ça posait des questions sérieuses sur la notion des droits de l'homme. Alors, et les pays du Sud se sont révoltés et n'étaient pas d'accord. Et ça a créé la théorie de la dépendance. Parce que le droit international de l'époque renforçait la théorie de l'indépendance. Ça veut dire que ça gardait les États du Sud dépendants de ceux du Nord. Et alors, il y avait une autre théorie qui était la requête du nouveau ordre économique mondial. Alors, l'ONU avait adopté une résolution pour cela en 1974. C'était, je veux dire, un acte précurseur de ce qui allait arriver. Et ça demandait la redistribution des pouvoirs et des décisions dans le monde et demandait quand même une économie équilibrée et que les pays du Sud ne soient pas dans une relation qui les défavorisait avec les États du Nord. Alors, mais plus important, qu'est-ce qui s'est passé en 1972? Le juriste sénégalais Kebambaï a défini, a fait le lien entre la notion de développement et de droits de l'homme dans sa lecture inaugurale à Strasbourg, en France, en 1972. C'était lui qui avait vraiment enfoncé, je veux dire, le clou dans la question du développement qui devait partir des charités ou bien simplement d'un acte humanitaire pour devenir une question radicale sur les droits de l'homme. Ce qui fait que cette théorie supportée par les États du tiers-monde était vraiment, c'était critique. Et puis, il faut noter, avant que je repasse la parole au professeur, il faut noter que Mbaye, c'est quelqu'un qui était quand même un grand juriste international. Il était à la Cour internationale de justice. C'était le premier noir, je crois, à travailler là-bas comme juge. Et puis, c'était pas lui seul, parce que les intellectuels africains, tous, avaient soutenu cette perspective. Et c'est ça qui a donné une force aux pays du Sud de questionner l'état de pauvreté, l'état de sous-développement, et en utilisant la notion des droits de l'homme. Et je crois que oui, ça c'est l'essentiel de son allocution. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you so much, Said. So now let us shift to the contestations of the right to development. We've talked about what it is. We've talked about the intellectual traditions, both academic and political, that shaped it, and the role of Africa and Africans in articulating what we now know as the right to development. I want to shift a little bit to the contestations proper, which is really the focus of this conversation. And then we'll kind of end with the challenges of operationalization. How do we implement this right to development so that it actually works for everyone? So 1986 happens. The right to development is formally adopted by the United Nations General Assembly, despite strong opposition from European states, some European states, I might add. but also very strong opposition from the United States, the only country that voted against this declaration. But even from the very beginning, if you do not have the most powerful country in the world buying into a new international legal norm, it doesn't matter whether 146 other countries agree with it, you are bound to have issues. You are bound to have some kind of contestation of what this norm is. And that really has been the challenge of the right to development. That although it is now firmly established in the United Nations system and has been affirmed by several other instruments, the Vienna Convention, for instance, on human rights affirms it, the Paris Climate Change Agreement affirms it, and many other international legal instruments affirm the right to development. But contestation persists for historical and ideological reasons. And I want us to run through some of these contestations. But to do so, we need to understand a little bit more about some of the unique contributions of the right to development. So one, the right to development foregrounds collective rights. It says that human rights are both individual rights and they are also collective rights. There's a language of indivisibility in the conversations about human rights. The other thing the right to development does is that it articulates a holistic approach to human rights. That human rights are not just narrow civil and political rights, the right to vote, the right, freedom of expression, right to life, freedom of religion, all those classic positive rights that we're familiar with. But that human rights also means the right to food, the right to shelter, the right to education. As Leopold Senghor famously said, human rights begins with breakfast. And some of these bread and butter issues are also human rights issues too. And so the right to development articulates all of these as rights. And so the right to development has been described as a holistic right that integrates the multiple dimensions of human rights. The other unique contribution of the right to development is that it calls for the duty bearer of this right. For every human right, there has to be a duty bearer. Otherwise, what is the use of an abstract human right that has no duty bearer? And that in international human rights law, the classic assumption is that the state is the primary duty bearer of human rights. The state is primarily responsible for protecting the rights of its citizens and those within its jurisdiction. And the right to development affirms that. It states very clearly that the state is the primary duty bearer for the right. But it goes further. It also says that human rights is a collective responsibility. So it is not just the state, it is also the international community. That states, and that the language of the declaration is that states have a duty to cooperate to remove the obstacles to development. And this is a very important contribution of the right to development agenda because it implicitly recognized that the challenges to development are not just in the hands of the state. Sometimes the state is helpless. The state is weak. The state is fragmented. The state is disempowered. And we have to remember, in the context of fragile post-colonial states, many of the states do not control the global economics that control the well-being of their own citizens. And so recognizing that in 1986, the drafters of the Declaration of the Declaration of the Right to Development, many of whom are from the global south and have experienced these firsthand, put in clauses that mandated the international community to work together to remove the obstacles to development. So the duty bearer for the right to development is not just the state, it's also the international community. And that places a responsibility on the international community to remove obstacles. It is also born out of the recognitions that in our increasingly globalized world, there are many corporations that are more powerful than the state. There are international organizations, multilateral organizations, the World Bank, IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions that are more powerful than the state. And they too must have an obligation under international human rights if we are to actualize the right to development. So these, I think, are the unique attributes of the right to development. They are very forward-looking. They address the realities of our unequal global economy, but they are also the foundations of contestation. And I'll just run through some of the key aspects of the right to development that have remained contested even as we speak. And a clear example of this contestation is the fact that the right of development is still soft law. It is still a declaration since 1986. The usual trajectory in international law is that a principle or a legal norm begins as a consensus by states, either in the form of a declaration or some other instrument. And then it gradually transitions into hard law. In other words, a covenant that is justiciable in legal terms, a covenant that can be applied by the courts, that the UN has reporting mechanisms for. The right to declaration, the right to development has languished as soft law, as a declaration, despite successive attempts to kind of evolve it into a covenant that is legally enforceable. And one of the reasons why this hasn't happened, it is happening now because as I speak to you, there is a draft covenant on the right to development finally making its way through intergovernmental negotiations at the UN General Assembly. But for the past 30 years, there has been an attempt to do this. And one of the reasons why this hasn't been successful was because of objections and contestations. And I will briefly run through some of these objections and contestations so that we can understand some of the possibilities and challenges that this right continues to face in terms of how it is implemented at both the global level and the local level. So the first contestation is whether human rights are individual rights or whether they're collective rights of peoples. Now, I would say that this is settled international law, because if you read the covenants on civil and political rights and the covenants on economic and social rights, it is clear that human rights is both an individual and collective rights. If you read the African Charter, in fact, the title of the African Charter is the African Charter for Human and People's Rights. It is very clear that human rights in the African context is articulated as both an individual and collective right. The right to development also makes this articulation, but not everyone agrees with this. Many states fear that collective rights would empower governments rather than people. Many states, particularly at the United Nations, continue to argue that human rights has to be seen essentially as an individual right, as rights that pertain mainly to individuals, and that bringing in a collective dimensions dilutes that right, and that states can take advantage of that to violate individual rights. However, developing states argue that colonialism and economic domination are experienced collectively, that many of what we consider human rights violations today, whether the grabbing of land, economic extractive industries grabbing land from communities, whether it's the effects of climate change that violates access to safe drinking water, that these are all collective violations and that we need to think of human rights not just as individual claims, but also as collective rights. So that is contestation number one. Contestation number two, domestic duties versus international duties. So like I said before, the right to development is very unique in that it acknowledges that the duty bearer is not just the state, but the international community. Now, there is a lot of debate over this because if you think about most other rights, it is clear that these are the responsibilities of the state. But the right to development frames responsibility as a collective one that also relates to the international community. Wealthy countries tend to object to this. They insist that development should be the primary responsibility of national governments. And they object to any framing of the right as having extraterritorial obligation that other states have a responsibility for. But developing countries have made the argument persuasively, I would argue, that in today's world, the states cannot be held responsible for everything. There are global forces that impede development, and so we need to think about duty bearers as both the state and the international community. Tension number 3, aid versus obligation. So the right to development, as I said before, articulates development as a fundamental human right, not as charity, not as humanitarian aid, not as something coming out of the goodwill of people or states. And now there's an objection to this because some states, mostly Western states, argue that development and support, development assistance has to be framed as charity, has to be framed as humanitarian aid, rather than a binding legal obligation. So you have that tension where mostly Western states, wealthy states, want to continue to frame development as charity, as humanitarian aid, as overseas development assistance, ODA, in UN language, whereas you find many states in the global south saying, no, this should be a fundamental human right. And then finally, there is the tension that I just articulated about whether development should be soft law or binding legally enforceable instruments. Many Western states would prefer to keep the right to development as soft law, as a declaration that states are not bound to follow. And many states in the global south, including many African states, argue that it is time to transition the right to development into a binding legal instrument. So these are 4, there are many others I could speak about, but these are some of the 4 areas of contestations in international human rights law that continue to inhibit the implementation of the right to development. And it is important to understand this, that the fact that you now have an international legal instrument doesn't always mean that there is a consensus in terms of how it is understood, or there's even consensus on how it will be implemented. And this is part of the work that I did at the United Nations and that many scholars continue to be engaged in, to find consensus around this important right so that we can begin to implement it. I'll let Serge translate, and then in the final section, I will talk about operationalization. Despite these contestations, despite these challenges, how can the right to development be operationalized in a way that really improves the objective living conditions of people in Africa and around the world?
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Thank you. Alors, je continue. On va, dans cette session, regarder plus les contestations, la contribution du droit au développement et au discours des droits de l'homme. Alors, on commence par reconnaître que après l'adoption de la déclaration en 1986, et on pouvait dire que le droit au développement est un fait accompli. C'est là, c'est déjà dans la déclaration, c'est un instrument de l'ONU. Maintenant, et cela n'empêche qu'il y avait toujours ce que j'appellerais ici des opposants, ou alors ceux qui étaient contre le droit au développement. Alors, ils ont amené des contestations qui ont toutefois affecté la pertinence du droit au développement. Et je vais immédiatement passer brièvement à ces contestations, ou alors commençons par la contribution du droit au développement. Et le droit au développement a souligné la notion de droit collectif, la question de l'indivisibilité des droits de l'homme qui ne sont pas divisibles, ils sont interdépendants, ils ne peuvent pas être divisés. Ça veut dire que le droit au développement présente une approche holistique et qui prend en compte tous les droits civils et politiques, les droits socio-économiques, le droit à la nourriture. Et comme disait Senghor, le droit commence par le petit déjeuner. Et donc, le professeur a souligné l'aspect multidimensionnel du droit au développement. Alors, l'autre contestation ou alors contribution du droit, c'est que le droit au développement a souligné les devoirs ou alors ceux responsables qui sont obligés les partis qui sont obligés de fournir ces droits à leur population. Alors, sous le droit international, on sait que l'État est le principal pourvoyeur des droits. Mais dans la théorie du droit au développement, il y a une responsabilité collective. Ça veut dire que le droit, la communauté internationale est aussi obligée d'assurer le droit au développement dans les États. Alors, cette théorie est venue parce que les États du Sud étant fragmentés et appauvris par les politiques internationales, on avait estimé que et, même les institutions internationales, les organisations internationales comme celle de Bretton Woods, avait également l'obligation de fournir les droits parce que les politiques internationales, les décisions prises à Genève ou à Washington affectent et, et la mise en œuvre de ces droits dans les pays du Sud. Alors, ben, il y a beaucoup de contestations ou alors et les raisons qui poussent certains États à dire, mais non, ça, c'est pas un droit. Il y a la notion du droit contraignant et et contre le droit non contraignant, ce que les Anglais appellent soft law. Ça veut dire la loi faible, si on peut le dire ainsi. Et la déclaration qui n'est pas contraignante n'est pas euh, justiciable. Ça veut dire qu'on ne peut pas amener une déclaration dans un tribunal de justice. Alors, et malgré les efforts de transformer cela en un droit contraignant, les États du Nord ou alors les États riches ont toujours essayé de créer un problème ou alors de créer des difficultés. Toutefois, il y a une ébauche maintenant sur la table qui est comme le draft de la Convention du droit au développement. En anglais, le covenant, le draft covenant, qui est vraiment une convention forte qui est présentement discutée à l'échelon international. Maintenant, il y a la contestation par rapport à l'obligation ou la qualité, la nature du droit. Pour certains, c'est un droit naturel, pour d'autres, c'est un droit individuel, et alors contre un droit collectif. Mais de toutes les façons, les deux traités de 1966, c'est-à-dire le traité sur les droits civils et politiques et les droits socio-économiques, reconnaissent que qu'il y a des droits collectifs. Maintenant, la Charte africaine des droits de l'homme et des peuples reconnaît encore la nature collective du droit de l'homme parce que ça parle également du droit des peuples. La notion de people, c'est les peuples, c'est collectif. Maintenant, au niveau même de l'ONU, la contestation reste là parce que les gens vont vous dire que si on fait des droits collectifs, ça va protéger les gouvernements qui vont abuser de leur peuple. Toutefois, la contestation est restée, mais la notion de droit collectif est très soulignée dans la Charte africaine des droits de l'homme. L'autre contestation, c'est encore la question si c'est les responsables, la responsabilité, c'est au niveau national ou au niveau international. J'ai déjà parlé de ça, ben, la responsabilité pour le droit au développement, la responsabilité est non seulement sur le plan national, mais la communauté internationale a un rôle clé à jouer. La troisième contestation, c'est sur la notion, est-ce que le droit doit être donné comme une aide internationale ou bien c'est une obligation de donner ou d'aider? Alors, pour les États du Nord, ça doit rester l'aide, ça doit être l'humanitaire. Mais les États du Sud disent non, et ça doit être une obligation. Donc, c'est une autre contestation. Et la dernière contestation, c'est comme on a déjà parlé, la nature contraignante ou non contraignante du droit de développement. Nous sommes divisés sur la question, mais comme j'ai dit tantôt, il y a une ébauche ou un draft, un covenant qui est sur la table et maintenant est débattu. Je vais donc maintenant laisser la parole au professeur afin qu'il nous parle de la mise en œuvre ou l'opérationnalisation de ce droit. Je vous remercie. Over to you, Bonnie.
Thank you so much, Sage. So, coming to trying to tie these together now. So, what is the value of the right to development? We've talked about the origins, the contestations. Now, I think the practical question that many of you would like to ask is, okay, what is the relevance? Why is this of significance to us as not just scholars of international human rights, but as Africans and people who are interested in development and the well-being of peoples around the world? Now, the argument that I make, not just in my capacity as an academic who works on this space, but also as someone who's worked at the United Nations on these questions, is that the right to development, despite its contestations, its ongoing contestations, remain more relevant today than ever. In fact, I would argue that the right to development is more important today than it was in the 1980s, when African diplomats and juries like Keba Mbaye first articulated it. The world has become more divided today. The wealth gap within and between nations has become even starker. Even as the world continues to advance technologically, even as more wealth begins to accrue in the hands of ever fewer people, we have more and more poor people today. Consider some of the statistics. The world's richest person at $1 trillion net worth is richer than the GDP of the two wealthiest African countries. So the world's richest person owns more than the collective wealth of the two leading African economies, Egypt, at least at today, Egypt and South Africa. That's 200 million people have less than one person in the world. It is a gaping inequality that is unprecedented in human history. The World Bank recent figure says that 847 million people are living on extreme poverty. Now, the World Bank has revised its figures, so it's no longer less than $1 a day. It's less than $2.15 a day. But even using this, updated metrics, 847 people are living in extreme poverty, even as the world creates more billionaires and trillionaires. And then for Africa, the statistics are even more concerning. Sub-Saharan Africa accounts for an overwhelming majority of the world's extreme poor. Africa is only 16% of the world population, but is home to 60% of the world's poorest people. Now, we can debate the origins of this or the roots of this, colonial history, a failure of political leaders, and developmental models. And really, that is not the focus of today's lecture. The focus here is what can the right to development do to contribute to addressing these gaping inequalities in our world. And I want to propose that one of the contributions of the right to development framework is accountability. That the right to development, it's unique as a human right in the way that it frames accountability. Who is accountable for development? Who should be held responsible for development? And what claims can individuals and groups and citizens make against the state, against the international community, and against each other, using the powerful language of human rights to ensure that development is extended to communities as a matter of right, not charity or humanitarian aid. So let us talk about what I call the circles of accountability within the international human rights framework as they relate to the right to development. The first is domestic accountability. African governments must mobilize resources fairly to combat corruption, regulate business, invest in public goods, disclose contracts, and set priorities that have the greatest impact on citizens. That is a right to development framework because the right to development frames responsibility primarily as a state responsibility. So much of the conversations we've had has focused so far on the tension and contestation between the global north and the global south. But that is not the whole story. The story is also the responsibility of government. The development is not just an international dynamic, it is a domestic dynamic. What is the responsibility of the state? And how can citizens hold states and their governments accountable, drawing on the language of the right to development? And this is something that we've talked about in a recent lecture I gave. I talked about the principle of progressive realization, which is an enshrined international human rights law principle. States will typically say we don't have enough money to meet all the needs of our people. The resources of the states are limited, and so we can provide education for everyone. We can provide health for everyone. The state has to prioritize. And this is a familiar argument we hear at the United Nations from resource-constrained states, mainly in the global south. And it's a legitimate argument. Resources are tight. Priorities are competing, but there's the principle of progressive realization that states can progressively move towards achieving these goals. They can show through clear indices how much they've achieved each year to ensure the right to development of their communities, to ensure that more children are in school, to ensure that there's more community healthcare. And these can be progressively tracked as a way of fulfilling or operationalizing the right to development. So the old argument that the state is resource constrained and as such cannot meet the economic and social goals of the right to development agenda, it's really not always tenable, particularly when you consider the principle of progressive realization that is enshrined in international human rights law. The second level of accountability is extraterritorial responsibility, which I've already talked about, that if development is to be achieved, we need to make sure that responsibility is not just confined to the state. We need to recognize that in an increasingly globalized world, there are powerful non-state actors that have an impact on the objective living conditions of people around the world, whether it's large extractive industries that are mining in Africa and many parts of the world, whether it's transnational corporations in the oil industry that have that are expropriating land and resources to the disadvantage of local communities. And so the right to development really frames this as a question of collective responsibility in terms of the role of international actors. And one of the good developments that I'm seeing within the United Nations is a new emphasis on business and human rights, the obligations of corporations to meet international human rights commitments, to uphold international human rights standards. It kind of shifts away from this assumption. Our international human rights system is very state-centric, but there's a growing recognition that we need to think about duties of non-state actors to implement international human rights. And the right to development provides us a tool for doing that. A lot of scholars have argued that even though the right to development, it is still a declaration, soft law, it can be viewed as a customary international law that can be invoked in courts that is can potentially be justiciable, and there are many jurisdictions around the world where the right to development has been invoked in legal cases. So it provides a language of rights that these kinds of claims can be made. And our hope, those of us who've worked in this space for many years, is that once we now have a legally binding instrument, a covenant on the right to development, that provides even more power for local people, for civil society actors, for individuals to begin to hold governments and corporations and other entities accountable for development, for their well-being. And there are many areas where these can become manifest. And I'll just run through some of them where I think the right to development is relevant in the African context. The first of them is critical minerals and the whole question of green extractivism. All across Africa, you see that the energy transition is leading to high demand of cobalt, lithium, copper, graphite, and rare earths. There is almost a second scramble for Africa, with many transnational corporations signing deals with governments to extract these minerals. Well, what does this mean for the right of development of the peoples whose land has been appropriated, whose wells have been poisoned, whose rivers have been poisoned because of this, whose forests have been cut down and decimated as a result of these new form of green extractivism? I would argue that the right to development provides a very powerful tool for challenging this trend, particularly in the emphasis on extraterritorial obligation. It is not just enough to focus on the state and the government, although those should be the primary focus for fulfilling right. We can now also talk about the companies, the corporations building huge data centers around the world that have an impact on the lives of ordinary people. Another one is climate change. We see the whole new movement on climate justice. That Africa, for instance, has contributed less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Much of what we now call the climate crisis is a consequence of the Industrial Revolution in the global north. Yet, Africa and many countries in the global south disproportionately bear the burdens. If you have been following the news, you would have heard the story of the mudslides in Nepal, Tibet, and parts of China that has killed many people because glaciers in the mountains melted in an unprecedented way and washed down and killed so many people. And that is a direct consequence of climate change. And so there is a whole talk now about climate justice. Those who are primarily responsible for this crisis need to pay their fair share in the way we mitigate this crisis, in the way we adapt to this crisis. And I would argue that the right to development provides us with a legal language in international law and domestic law to do just that, to enforce climate justice. I'll let Sage translate and I'll say a few words of conclusion and then we'll shift to questions. Sage, please.
Okay. Thank you very much, Bonnie. Thank you. Alors, je voudrais rapidement traduire le message. En fait, le professeur essaye de voir si on ne peut pas, quelle est la valeur ajoutée du droit au développement. Est-ce que le droit au développement, après l'adoption de la déclaration de 86, est important? Est-ce que c'est relevant? Est-ce que ça adresse les problèmes du jour? Est-ce que ça vaut vraiment la peine de se concentrer ou bien d'être le centre de nos efforts? Alors, le professeur démontre très bien que le droit est devenu encore plus important que par le passé, parce que, en effet, on vit un état de misère prononcé dans les pays du Sud. Donc, l'homme le plus riche du monde a plus d'argent que les économies d'Afrique et des pays africains tels que l'Égypte et l'Afrique du Sud. Il parle alors d'une inégalité qui fait peur. C'est effrayant de voir le niveau d'inégalité dans le monde. et il dit 847 millions de personnes vivent dans des conditions d'extrême pauvreté. Et ce qui fait qu'il faut absolument que le droit au développement, en fait, vienne au secours de ces personnes. Et il peut dire l'Afrique a 60% des plus pauvres du monde. Ils vivent en Afrique, malgré toutes nos richesses en minéral. Alors, il pense que le droit au développement donne un cadre juridique qui permet vraiment de résoudre le problème. Alors, maintenant, il aborde la question de la responsabilité. Qui est responsable pour rendre compte? Qui doit rendre compte? Alors, comme on l'a vu tantôt, d'une part, on a l'État et d'autre part, on a la communauté internationale. Alors, quand tu reviens maintenant pour analyser les questions de responsabilité étatique, et il parle de l'État a l'obligation d'éradiquer la corruption et qui est un problème dans nos pays et de réguler les business ou les compagnies et qui sont dans nos pays. L'État doit adopter les politiques qui permettent aux gens de se développer. Ça veut dire la règle de droit doit aider sur le plan national. Donc, c'est le principe. Et puis, le professeur a beaucoup insisté sur la notion de la réalisation progressive des droits de l'homme, qui est vraiment un principe reconnu. Je crois que c'est l'article 2, alinéa 1 du traité sur les droits sociaux et politiques, qui reconnaît vraiment que l'État a l'obligation de délivrer ou de donner les droits de l'homme, ou de pouvoir, voilà le mot que je cherchais, de pouvoir les droits de l'homme, et de manière progressive. L'État, au moins, doit démontrer chaque année qu'il y a une évolution, par exemple, pour pouvoir le droit à l'éducation et le droit à la santé, l'État doit montrer de manière progressive ce qui est fait. Maintenant, le deuxième point, c'est la responsabilité extraterritoriale, c'est-à-dire la responsabilité collective des acteurs qui ne sont pas les États, des acteurs non étatiques, tels que les compagnies transnationales et les organisations internationales. Et en fait, cette notion a été soulignée dans la notion de business and human rights, ça veut dire et les affaires, ou alors le business et les droits de la personne. Parce qu'on a constaté que les business et les compagnies sont aussi des grands violateurs des droits de l'homme. Maintenant, il dit le droit au développement permet alors, sous le droit international, et d'obliger les compagnies à respecter les droits de l'homme et autant que possible. Donc, et on a également noté qu'en Afrique, il y a des choses, il y a des phénomènes et, que le droit de développement doit permettre de protéger. On a par exemple les minéraux critiques. Tous les pays africains ont des minéraux. On a l'or, on a le cobalt, on a et tout ce que vous pouvez imaginer que nos terres regorgent. Et autour de ces minéraux, il y a des populations qui ne bénéficient pas, qui souffrent et qui n'ont rien. Alors, le droit de développement doit donner, pouvoir un cadre juridique pour pouvoir obliger les compagnies transnationales qui exploitent tous ces minéraux de rendre compte de leurs actions. Alors, le professeur a également souligné la question des échanges climatiques. Et maintenant, on parle de la justice climatique parce que les échanges climatiques ont des conséquences je dirais, terrible sur les pays du Sud, alors que ceux qui sont responsables de ces échanges sont des pays du Nord. Alors la justice climatique voudrait que ces États du Nord prennent leurs responsabilités. Et le professeur a illustré ça en nous parlant de tremblements de terre comme celui qui s'est passé au Népal et tout récemment. C'est les conséquences du changement climatique dont les peuples du Sud, pour la plupart, souffrent alors qu'en réalité, ces peuples n'ont rien fait. Alors la notion de justice climatique s'aligne très bien dans le discours du droit au développement et qui doit forcer les responsables de tous ces changements climatiques de prendre leurs responsabilités. Merci. Over to you, Prof.
So, yeah, thank you, Serge. A few concluding remarks. So we have enough time for questions, very few remarks. So what are my conclusions? The right to development has survived despite opposition from some quarters, as I've explained, because the conditions that produced it have not disappeared. Wealth and decision-making remain highly concentrated. Colonial legacies persist. Debt and climate vulnerability narrow choices for ordinary people around the world. New technologies have created new hierarchies. Domestic elites still evoke development while excluding people from the benefits. But the right is also involved. I argue that it now offers a language for climate justice, digital equality, indigenous rights, gender equality, migration, reparatory justice, and institutional reform. It is an individual and collective right. It's a holistic right that ordinary people can invoke and deploy to demand an improvement in their well-being. But the deepest promise of the right to development is democratic. A fundamental principle of inclusiveness. Development should not be something done to people. It should be a process they shape, they contribute to, and they're able to enjoy the benefits of, as enshrined in the Declaration on the Right to Development. I conclude that the global politics of power will not disappear because we adopt a declaration or a covenant. So even the legally binding instruments will not solve all the questions. Law cannot substitute for political struggle, but law can name injustice, organize claims, discipline institutions, and widen the opportunities for all. And finally, as African scholars and practitioners, and I know many of us here are practitioners, the task is therefore larger than just defending an African claim. It is to develop a rigorous, self-critical, and universal framework that confronts external domination, but also domestic capture and new forms of economic, technological, and ecological inequality. And I think the right to development provides us with powerful tool to do just that. I thank you all for listening. It was great having this talk. Over to Professor Falola or to Serge.
1 second. Yes, thank you very much. OK, collègues, maintenant, on va passer à, je dirais simplement, le mot de la fin et la conclusion du professeur qui il dit, après tout, malgré toute la controverse ou la contestation, le droit au développement a très bien survécu. On a quasiment, malgré les oppositions, le droit au développement a bien évolué, a défini son chemin ou sa trajectoire. Et maintenant, on a l'élite domestique qui sait tout de même, qui a ce droit. Et le droit a formalisé les questions de la protection des droits des peuples autochtones et la justice est réparative ou distributive et la justice climatique et a vraiment souligné la notion d'inclusivité qu'on ne peut pas mettre de côté. Alors, de toutes les façons, le droit au développement, malgré son existence, il y aura toujours, même quand on aura le pacte contraignant, le droit au développement va absolument toujours générer la controverse parce que les plus puissants ne vont pas simplement l'approuver, mais toutefois, le droit au développement permet d'avoir un instrument juridique pour lesquels on peut dénoncer les injustices, demander aux gens de prendre leurs responsabilités et je dirais quelque part mettre sur pied un cadre juridique pour la défense des droits humains pris dans son ensemble. Et il est très heureux d'avoir été avec nous. Before I give the floor to Professor Falola, I will still have time and I have a few questions that were sent to me that I should pose to you. Then after that, we should then be able to give the floor to Prof. Falola. For the first question, the question is to know, in all these conversations, because we know that the right to development, we can, as you rightly pointed out in the lecture, originated from Africa. Now, what is the place of people of African descent in this? Because they also feel African, but they might be in the Caribbean, everywhere in the world. To what extent they are recognized in all this conversation? That's the first question. Over to you, Prof.
Thank you very much, Serge, for that question. I think that the African diaspora are an important part of this conversation. When you look at the history of the right to development or the new international economic order or the whole post-colonial movement for rights expansion within the United Nations, many of the scholars who framed these conversations, the African scholars, were influenced by African diaspora scholars, the Marcus Garvey, the Aimé Césaire. I mean, you cannot read any work by Keban Baye, the jurist, or even Senghor, without seeing some of the influences of, diaspora scholars, early diaspora writings, that kind of connection. If you think about some of the early Pan-Africanist ideas of African leaders like Nkrumah, they were founded on Marcus Garvey's ideas, the Black Star Line, the whole idea of connecting the diaspora with Africa. So there's a long intellectual tradition of connection that led to that historical moment. But I would argue that it continues even today in multilateral conversation. You look at the leadership of the Prime Minister of Barbados, Prime Minister Her Excellency Prime Minister Motley, on climate justice and reparative justice for the slave trade. It's leadership that connects with some of the advocacy that has been done in Africa. So to answer your question, there is a historical connection, but I would argue that even today there is a strong solidarity in how these arguments are being made. And Serge, you know this well. When you sit at the United Nations Human Rights Council, or you follow the proceedings of the General Assembly, you see that there is a clear solidarity in terms of the positions of diasporic Africans and continental Africans on some of these issues. Because frankly, the Caribbean states face the same challenges, whether it is climate change, whether it's the effects of international global political economy on domestic economy. They face exactly the same challenges that many developing African states face. And so I would argue that there is a strong historical connection, a strong intellectual connection, and one that continues in the advocacy for the right to development, even at multilateral bodies.
Thank you. Okay, let me quickly, I will be brief because we have 2 or 3 other questions. I will try to be brief. Alors, la question était de savoir quelle est la place des afro-descendants sur cette question du droit au développement. On a reçu cette question et parce que les afro-descendants, parfois, c'est comme s'ils ne faisaient pas partie du discours, alors qu'en réalité, ils ont également les mêmes soucis que les autres Africains et pays du Sud en général. Alors, le professeur dit que quand on regarde l'histoire même du panafricanisme, elle a été, et les grands maîtres du panafricanisme, tels que Nkrumah, tels que Senghor, tous ces gars, ils ont travaillé avec la même lignée des gars comme Marcus Garvey. Et on peut même venir au point même de voir que les afro-descendants comme Bob Marley, ils ont aussi informé le discours par leurs chansons, par leur musique. Et on ne peut pas, entre autres, oublier le leadership du Premier ministre de la Barbade, appelée Barbados, je crois en français, c'est la Barbade, les îles Barbades, et qui, jusqu'aujourd'hui, pousse toujours pour les questions de réparation. Ça veut dire qu'on a un lien historique, les pays africains ont un lien historique, et avec les pays du Caraïbe qui souffrent des mêmes problèmes de pauvreté, des changes climatiques que les autres pays africains, ce qui fait que le lien est là et les peuples, les autres descendants d'Afrique, ils sont également très bien concernés. Et let's move to the next question, which is to say, the person said, after the decades of the narrative on the right to development, I'm sure, and I think you have responded to this in your lecture, don't you perceive the probability of a conspiracy theory from the West? Don't you think they are conspiring not to get the right to development to become reality? I think, yes, this brings us to the polemic of power and contestation that you spoke about. Over to you, Prof.
Yeah, I wouldn't frame it as conspiracy. I think it's self-interest, which is a global phenomenon, and I think we have to be pragmatic about the realities. I mean, it's natural. Those who have, tend to be reluctant to share. And I have also to say, in the right to development discourse, it's not just global North and South, because even within the South, in the global South, you now have countries that have moved up the ladder and are now considered middle-income countries. Some of these countries do not quite buy all the values of the right to development, because it would mean that they also have obligations towards the poorer states. So I think we need to kind of complicate the assumption that it's a global Northwest and South thing. It's a little bit more complicated. States are not in a permanent state of development. I'll give you a classic example of Morocco. Morocco has made so much strides economically now that within the UN system, there's talk about Morocco being, a middle-income state. And the question was some of the interesting debates we had at the United Nations was, well, if that becomes the case, what is Morocco's responsibility to the rest of Africa on the right to development? And so it becomes a little bit complex. What about some of the former colonial states in Asia? Malaysia, Indonesia, some of these countries that are moving up the ladder and become middle-income states. What are their obligations to the poorer states on the right to development? So it's a more complicated story. And the approach that I take is, rather than talk about conspiracy theory, is to talk about self-interest. And my argument lately has been, let us think about the right to development as a rising tide that lifts all boats. Yes, there is an inclination for states to be self-interested, but if we are going to solve the global challenges that confront our world, climate change, existential threats, digital use of digital technology, ethical use of AI, pandemics when they occur again, these are global challenges. There can be no questions of self-interest. We have to work together. We saw during the pandemic that no matter how rich a country is, no matter how many vaccines it stockpiles, if there are people in the poorest part of the world who have no access to vaccines, that rich country will get a second, a third, and fourth wave of the pandemic. And that's exactly what happened. And we see that with climate change, that no country, however well-resourced, can solve these problems alone. So I always make the case for enlightened self-interest to challenge the kind of parochial self-interest that drives some of these debates. And I think that is how we need to frame this conversation and focus to say the right to development is not charity. It is pragmatic way of addressing the global challenges in the world. And finally, even migration. I've told my colleagues at the United Nations from the EU that, you know, the right to development is central to how you solve the migration crisis. If people are desperate in their countries, if climate change pushes people out of their countries, they will risk their lives to come to Europe. I don't care how high the fence is. I don't care how wide the ocean is. If people are desperately poor, Fortress Europe cannot save you. And so it's in the strategic and enlightened interest of even those in the West to think seriously about the right to development. I mean, we do not expect that all countries would achieve the same level of development at the same time, but people have to find some relative economic stability in their own countries and spaces. If that doesn't happen, then you inevitably get these global crises that are not being addressed holistically. And this is where the right to development comes in. And this is how I try to sell it to those in the global north, that it is in their enlightened self-interest to buy into the principles of the right to development because they address global challenges in a way that no other human rights principle does.
Thank you, Prof. La question est posée était simplement de savoir s'il n'y avait pas un complot par les pays du Nord contre ceux du Sud. Mais le professeur Boni dit non, c'est une question d'intérêt personnel, d'intérêt étatique. Chaque État a ses intérêts et veut préserver ses intérêts. Et, et le professeur démontre ici que non, on doit dépasser la question de complot et regarder les intérêts des États. Les États agissent par intérêt. Et d'ailleurs, il démontre que même dans les pays qui sont devenus, qui ont évolué et ont progressé, sont devenus des pays, je dirais, à revenu intermédiaire, et où le développement est mieux que dans d'autres pays. Eux-mêmes aussi, maintenant, ils ont l'obligation de voir comment contribuer au droit au développement dans d'autres pays. Il a pris l'exemple pratique du Maroc. Le Maroc, qui est un pays maintenant plus développé, au niveau des Nations Unies, la question se pose. Mais les Marocains, puisque vous avez avancé, regardez maintenant ce qu'on peut faire. Alors, le professeur dit que non, la théorie du droit au développement doit dépasser la question des revenus ou alors la question des intérêts. Parce qu'il y a les questions des échanges climatiques et, et, et l'utilisation éthique de l'intelligence artificielle. Comment on doit faire pour que les pauvres n'en meurent pas? Et puis, en période de pandémie, comme pendant le Covid, on a noté que les pays du Sud ne recevaient pas les vaccins à temps. Et le professeur dit que le discours du droit de développement vise à amener cette égalité entre les États et les personnes. L'un des exemples les plus forts, il dit que la notion de droit au développement doit aider à résoudre la question des migrations. Et parce que, et comme il le démontre dans ses interventions à l'ONU et partout ailleurs, tant que il y a pauvreté dans le Grand Sud, tant qu'il y a les échanges climatiques qui font fuir les gens, même si l'Europe construit des forteresses, des murs les plus hauts du monde, les gens vont toujours réussir à nager pour y arriver ou à passer par le désert ou par d'autres moyens pour arriver sur ce territoire. Et I want to move to the next question, which is to say, in many countries of the global south, patriarchy still exists. How do we address the crisis of patriarchy to be able to achieve the right to development for everyone?
A very good question. Time did not permit me to talk about gender. I always try to bring a gendered analysis to my conversation about human rights because we cannot assume that we all experience deprivation and human rights abuse equally. Some experience it more than others by just their location in life. Gender is one of them, class is another, in the African context, ethnic nationality, religion, and all of that. But since this question borders on patriarchy, I want to spend some time on that. So the question of development, it's if you recall the definition, the right of everyone, and individuals and communities, to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy the process of development. And then when I went further to define how we understand development within the framework of the right to development, I made reference to people choosing how to improve the conditions of their life, people having choice. I drew on Amartya Sen's famous capabilities approach that would think about development as providing people with the capabilities to improve their life. And when you put all of this together, what it tells me is that the right to development provides a very powerful tool for challenging oppressive patriarchy and creating, addressing questions of gender inequality. And we already see it being used. I mean, one of the things I didn't have time to talk about in this class, just because of the limitations we had, was how the right of development framework is actually being used on the ground. When I served as chair of the UN expert mechanism on the right to development, one of my mandates was to travel around the world to see how ordinary people, grassroots organizations, were drawing on the language of the right to development in their advocacy and even in litigation for empowerment from Latin America, across Africa, even in Europe. And that is the interesting thing about the right to development framework. The assumption that it's a third world right, it's a global south right. In Europe, for instance, the Roma people who are marginalized, who are discriminated against, indigenous people in Norway, and in the Scandinavian countries who have demanded a truth commission to look at the historical injustices meted out on them in those contexts, are increasingly drawing on the right to development, to demand inclusion, to demand their rights. And so one of the things that I have seen is that gender groups, women's group, are also drawing on the right to development. In Mexico, for instance, women's advocacy groups drew extensively on right to development for their local advocacy. We are trying to socialize that more. The expert mechanism on the right to development in the UN has worked hard to socialize this, to promote the right to development, so that more civil society groups, more community groups fighting for their rights on the ground, whether against the state or against corporations or against patriarchy, can begin to marshal the discourse and the legal framework of the right to development to enforce their rights, because these are rights to which almost every African state has signed up to. So there are obligations that have already been made. And what citizens are asking when they deploy the right to development is that states and governments should live up to these commitments they have made at an international level. So I definitely see the relevance of how the right to development can be one of the many instruments that civil society groups can use to challenge oppressive patriarchy and create living conditions that improve the well-being of all.
Thank you very much, Prof. I'm just checking. Okay. I will try to be brief because we are running out of time. Alors, la question était plutôt de savoir comment nos sociétés qui sont caractérisées, qui sont des sociétés patriarcales, où les hommes très souvent dominent tout et au détriment des femmes, et comment est-ce que le discours du droit au développement peut aider à résoudre cette question d'égalité? Alors, le professeur dit que, ben, en fait, la notion de droit au développement, comme il a dit tantôt, c'est le droit de tout le monde de participer, de contribuer, Hein, d'avoir sa voix là dehors, de mettre la voix dehors. Et il a insisté sur la théorie des capacités ou capacités, en français aussi, et la théorie de Amartya Sen, qui vise à améliorer les capacités de tout le monde pour pouvoir participer et jouir du droit au développement. Alors, et il dit comment ça peut se mettre en œuvre, comment ça s'était mis en œuvre. Il a dit, par exemple, pendant qu'il était le président du mécanisme des experts pour le droit au développement à l'ONU, une de ses missions était de voyager partout dans le monde pour voir comment le droit au développement est mis en œuvre. Et il a constaté que, par exemple, il fallait voir les gens qui sont les discriminés ou marginalisés, comme les populations romanes, les Roms là-bas en Europe et les autochtones en Norvège. Tout ce monde se base maintenant sur le discours du droit au développement pour demander l'égalité. Et les questions de genre, et les femmes et puis les organisations qui plaident pour l'égalité des genres, et également, et s'appuie sur le discours au droit au développement pour bousculer et faire tache d'huile dans les questions d'égalité. C'est pour dire que la question d'adresser les sociétés patriarcales, le droit au développement, en fait, est pour voir un cadre juridique excellent pour pouvoir résoudre ces questions-là. Et j'espère que, given that we have only 4 minutes, I think we can stop here. But perhaps before I give the floor to Prof. Falola to tell us the next stage, just to take a moment to appreciate Prof. Bonnie. Thank you so much. You are offering these 2 special lectures to my university, to my faculty. Many of my students are here, my colleagues are here. We are so grateful to have a scholar of your caliber to join this at our university. You know, for us, we can brag because there is no better expert to speak about this topic that would really explain it like you did. You put something so complex, you made it so accessible, even for non-lawyers. Everybody can hear it. Really, you bring it home. We are so grateful for your time, and thanking Prof. Falola for establishing the masterclass. We are glad to have been part of this, and God willing, we will meet again, perhaps in another masterclass. But we are so grateful. Thank you, Prof. Bonnie. I will also use the floor to thank my colleague, Mr. Kanya, who is the person who administered the work, and thanks everyone here. I see the colleague, Prof. John Mark, who is at the University of Western Cape, who is here. Everyone online, those on YouTube, those here on the link, we are so grateful to have you. Bonnie, thank you for the excellent lecture. We so much appreciate that. That's great. It's great to have you here. Over to you, sir. The great one, Prof. Falola. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sajis Kamga, the Dean of the Law School, University of the Free State, where I'm also an alumnus. I have a professorship there, and they were kind to have given me an honorary doctorate of law. So I'm a member of that campus. I'm very grateful. I must express my gratitude to 11 campuses who joined. They put all their students in halls. So you can't see them on Zoom, but they're watching this program. And in totality, there are close to 3,000 students who have been able to listen to this program. We are going to put it on YouTube for those others to join. 2 vice chancellors joined, the vice chancellor of Northwest University, Sokoto, and the Vice Chancellor of Base University in Abuja, they joined, and some others. Professor Badijo, former UN careerist, also joined, and many others who have joined. I'm very, very grateful to you all. Of course, I'm grateful to the lecturer. What is next? We'll be sending questions to those who want to have a certificate. They have to answer questions, they have to do projects. And we already have 2 graders, one based in Nairobi and the other based in Cairo, because we maintain objectivity and neutrality. Both Professor Bonnie Bauer and Professor Kamga will not be involved in grading this. We'll show them the questions, or they will not be involved. And we'll just give them a list of those who are able to pass the project, and they will attest their certificate. Thank you all.
Sir, without interrupting you, please, without interrupting you, there are people here who are French-speaking people. I hope there will be a way to also involve them if they want to do theirs in French. It could be the same question in French.
We'll
I can recommend someone who can.
Okay.
We can recommend someone who can grade it for them.
Thank you very much.